Here is something that requires a moment to fully absorb. In 1984, the highest-grossing action film in America was not made by a major studio. It did not have a 9-figure budget. It did not have a director whose name the critics recognized or a screenplay that anyone was calling sophisticated. It was a low-budget film about a Vietnam veteran who goes back to Southeast Asia alone to rescue the prisoners of war that the American government had decided to forget. It opened at number 1, not because of marketing, not because of a saturation release strategy or a carefully orchestrated awards campaign, because 10 years after the fall of Saigon, millions of Americans walked into theaters carrying something they had never been able to put down, a grief and a rage, and an unresolved sense of national injury that the political class had not addressed and that the culture had mostly avoided. And found in the specific image of Chuck Norris crossing a river with a machine gun, something that felt like relief. Missing in Action was not a great film. It was a necessary one. And understanding why it was necessary, understanding the specific wound it was pressing on and the specific man whose credibility made the pressure feel earned, is the only way to understand what Chuck Norris actually was to a generation of Americans who needed him more than they needed most things Hollywood was selling. This is episode 4, The Peak, the symbol, and the private man behind the most public image of his career. The America that Missing in Action arrives in during the autumn of 1984 is a country in the middle of a specific kind of recovery. The 1970s had been a decade of national confidence crisis. Watergate, the oil embargo, the Iran hostage situation, and above all, the long shadow of Vietnam, which had ended not with the triumphant return of victorious soldiers, but with helicopters lifting off embassy rooftops and a country that could not find a coherent language for what had happened to it. The specific injury of Vietnam was not simply the military loss. Losses can be processed, understood, assigned to failures of strategy or policy or intelligence, and filed under lessons learned. The injury was more complicated, the sense that the country had sent its sons to fight in good faith and then failed them, that the soldiers who served competently and courageously had been abandoned by the political and institutional structures that owed them support, that the sacrifice had not been honored by the culture that demanded it. The veterans who came home from Vietnam did not receive what the veterans of previous American wars had received. There were no ticker-tape parades. There was no broad cultural acknowledgement of service that distinguished between the men who fought and the policies that sent them. The country was so exhausted and so conflicted about the war itself that it had no clean mechanism for honoring the people who fought it without appearing to honor the decision that sent them, and the two things, the sacrifice of the soldiers and the catastrophic mismanagement of the war by its political architects, became confused in the cultural conversation in ways that cost the veterans something they could not easily name but felt every day. They came home to silence, and sometimes to hostility, and almost always to a society that preferred not to look directly at what they had been through. The psychological cost of this reception, the specific damage of returning from combat to a country that wants to look away, compounded the damage of the combat itself. The veterans of Vietnam are, through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a population carrying wounds that the medical establishment is only beginning to understand how to name, let alone treat. Ronald Reagan's election in 1980 is, among many other things, a response to this injury. His presidency is built in significant part on the rehabilitation of American military confidence and national pride. The explicit argument that America is a great nation whose greatness was temporarily obscured by the failures of the previous decade, and that greatness restored is the natural condition of American life. The argument resonates with an electorate that finds the alternative, accepting that the injury was deep, the failure real, the recovery incomplete, too painful to sustain as a permanent condition. Into this environment, Chuck Norris arrives as the most precise possible cinematic expression of what the culture needs. His characters are Vietnam veterans. They are technically competent in ways that the policy decisions that surrounded them were not. They are loyal to the men beside them with an absoluteness that the political calculations of the war never matched. They are failed by institutions, by by governments that negotiate away their comrades, by bureaucracies that prefer convenient lies to inconvenient rescues, and they respond to institutional failure by doing themselves what the institutions will not do. They win. The fantasy is specific, and the audience that responds to it is specific. They are veterans who watched their service be first mismanaged and then dishonored. They are families of veterans who came home changed in ways that nobody in their communities knew how to address. They are Americans who felt, during the 1970s, a kind of national shame that they could not articulate and could not resolve, and who find in the Chuck Norris action hero a version of the American military story that ends the way they needed it to end. Chuck Norris does not manufacture this resonance. He does not calculate it or engineer it or consult with political advisors about which cultural nerve to press. He makes films about the values he actually holds: loyalty, justice, the refusal to abandon the people depending on you. And the America of 1984 turns out to need exactly those values expressed with exactly the kind of physical credibility that a world martial arts champion and genuine Air Force veteran can provide. The alignment between the man and the moment is not accidental, but it is not cynical either. The Cannon Films partnership that produces the peak years of Chuck Norris's film career is one of the more unusual relationships in Hollywood history, a marriage between a performer whose values are entirely sincere and producers whose primary relationship to values is commercial, conducted in the specific context of the 1980s action film industry where the intersection of sincerity and commerce was more productive than it had any right to be. Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, the Israeli cousins who founded Cannon Films, are not filmmakers in the artistic sense. They are producers in the most industrial sense, people whose talent lies in identifying what audiences want, assembling the elements that deliver it at the lowest possible cost, and releasing the result with the confidence of people who understand that the right product at the right moment does not require critical validation to find its audience. They identify Chuck Norris as the right product for the right moment, with the instinctive commercial intelligence that is their genuine gift. And they build a production relationship around him with a focus and a scale that no previous studio has offered. The films come quickly. Missing in Action in 1984. Its prequel, Missing in Action 2, in 1985. Invasion, U.S.A. in 1985. Delta Force in 1986. Code of Silence in 1985. The output is prolific by any standard and extraordinary by the standard of an actor who had spent a decade making films slowly and at low budgets. The quality varies. This is the honest assessment of a body of work produced at this pace and at these budgets, and Chuck is not unaware of it. He is a professional with specific standards, and the gap between what the Cannon model produces and what those standards would ideally require is sometimes visible. But he understands the equation. The Cannon machine gives him the scale and the frequency of release that builds the kind of audience relationship that slower, more selective film careers cannot produce, and the films, whatever their individual limitations, consistently deliver the essential thing: the physical authenticity, the character values, the specific connection to the audience that is the only non-negotiable element of everything he makes. Code of Silence, released in 1985, is the film that critics and serious students of the Chuck Norris body of work consistently identify as the best, a more grounded, less fantastical action film that gives him the opportunity to demonstrate a range of screen performance that the POW rescue films do not require. He plays a Chicago detective navigating corrupt colleagues and organized crime with a moral clarity and a physical effectiveness that the film treats with more sophistication than his typical Cannon output. The reviews are the best of his career. The film performs well commercially. It is, for a brief moment, a signal that something more dimensionally interesting might be possible in the next phase of the career. Delta Force arrives in 1986 and returns to the more overtly political register. The film is based on the real-life hijacking of TWA Flight 847 in 1985, a traumatic event that ended with an American soldier murdered by terrorists and his body thrown onto the tarmac, and it tells a version of the story in which American special forces rescue the hostages with the kind of decisive, overwhelming effectiveness that the real-world response could not achieve. Chuck plays Major Scott McCoy alongside Lee Marvin in what will be Marvin's final film, and the pairing of the old Hollywood warrior with the new produces some of the most genuinely affecting scenes in either man's later career. Reagan attends a screening. The cultural alignment between the presidency and the action hero is at its most visible, the two men who most completely embody the specific version of American strength that the 1980s required standing in the same frame, the political project and its popular cultural expression recognizing each other. Behind the public image of the action hero, the machine gun, the roundhouse kick, the American flag, the relentless forward motion of characters who do not accept the word impossible, is a private life that the films never quite capture and that Chuck Norris protects with the same disciplined consistency he applies to everything else. His marriage to Diane Holchek, who married him before Korea and before the garage schools and before the championships and before any of it, is under the sustained pressure of everything that success produces in a life that was not designed for success. They have two sons, Mike and Eric, who grow up in the specific environment of a father whose face is on movie posters and whose schedule is determined by the needs of a career that has become considerably larger than the household it serves. Chuck is not an absent father in the way that his own father was absent. That specific wound runs too deep for him to replicate it without awareness. But he is a father whose presence is complicated by the demands of a career that requires him to be on sets, in training, in the specific physical and psychological preparation that action filmmaking requires. The balance is imperfect. The effort to maintain it is genuine. The sons, Mike and Eric, grow up with the specific complexity of children whose father is a cultural symbol as well as a parent. The gap between the man on the poster and the man at the kitchen table is not as large as it is for many celebrities because Chuck's public values and his private values are genuinely continuous. He does not perform one set of principles for the camera and practice another at home, but the gap between the father who is present and the father who is required elsewhere is real, and it produces in his sons the particular mixture of pride and longing that is the specific emotional inheritance of children raised in the shadow of a career that is also a calling. He attends what he can attend. He makes the calls when he cannot be there in person. He applies to fatherhood the same honest assessment he applies to everything, identifying where he is falling short of what the situation requires and working to close the gap without the self-deception that allows some people to believe that good intentions compensate for physical absence. He knows the difference. He tries to close it. He does not always succeed. Chuck is not an absent father in the way that his own father was absent, when that wound shapes his awareness of what fatherhood requires, even when the career makes it hard to deliver. He trains every morning. This is not a professional obligation. It is the daily practice that has been the organizing ritual of his adult life since the Korean dojang, the thing that does not change regardless of what the day will subsequently require. The discipline of martial arts training is not something Chuck Norris does because it serves his career, though it serves it completely. He does it because it is who he is. The training hall is the place where the quieter, more private version of himself, the one that does not need to be Chuck Norris the action star, exists in its most honest form. He is, on set and off it, the professional that his crews consistently describe in the same terms: prepared, punctual, untemperamental. The actor who knows his material and does the work without generating the drama that film productions produce in such reliable abundance from less disciplined performers. Directors value this. Producers value this. The crews who spend weeks in difficult locations value it most. The knowledge that the man at the center of the production is going to show up at call time, ready to work, every time, without exception. The specific quality of his set behavior is a direct expression of his character in a way that is not always true of actors, who can be one thing on camera and another off it. Chuck Norris is the same person in both contexts. The same standards, the same work ethic, the same treatment of everyone from the director to the person who brings the coffee as deserving of the same basic respect. This consistency is noticed and remembered by everyone who works with him, and it produces a professional reputation that outlasts any individual film performance. The personal faith that will become more publicly central in the later years is present through the 1980s in the form it has always taken, a private practice rather than a public performance, the foundation that the discipline sits on rather than a separate structure alongside it. Chuck does not wear his Christianity as a credential or wield it as a cultural positioning. It is simply there, in the decisions he makes and the way he treats people and the specific quality of his interior life that the external discipline both requires and expresses. The peak of the action star years runs from approximately 1983 to 1987, and the decline that follows it is the specific decline of a genre rather than a performer, the natural consequence of the cultural moment that produced the genre beginning to shift into something else. The action film of the mid-1980s is a precise product of its specific historical conditions. The Vietnam wound, the Reagan restoration, the Cold War tension, the specific American need for images of competent, decisive, morally uncomplicated physical heroism. These conditions produce the genre and sustain it for the better part of a decade. They do not sustain it forever. Cultural wounds, when they begin to heal, stop requiring the specific medicine that the wound demanded. The America of 1988 is not the America of 1984. The specific raw grief and unresolved anger that made missing in action feel like relief has, over 4 years of films and political rhetoric and the gradual passage of time, begun to find other forms of expression. The audience has not disappeared. The need has moderated. Chuck watches this shift with the same analytical attention he brought to the tournament circuit in the 1960s, when he was losing to fighters who were better than he was and studying what the losses were telling him. The information is clear. The specific cultural moment that made him the biggest action star in America is changing. And the question is not whether to resist the change. That is not a question worth asking, but what the next thing is and how to prepare for it. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone are transforming the action film in the mid-1980s in ways that push it toward a larger scale and a more self-conscious theatricality that the Chuck Norris model, grounded, credible, physically authentic in the specific way that genuine martial arts training produces, is not designed to compete with. The Terminator and the Rambo franchise operate at a level of cultural spectacle that requires a different kind of star, and Schwarzenegger and Stallone are those stars in ways that Chuck Norris, by temperament and by the specific nature of his appeal, is not. Jean-Claude Van Damme and Steven Seagal emerged from the martial arts tradition that Chuck helped establish and offer the next generation of audiences a version of the physical action hero that has absorbed and updated what he built. They are younger, their martial arts backgrounds are different from his, and they represent the natural evolution of a genre that Chuck Norris effectively founded. He watches all of this with the equanimity of a man who has been here before. The tournament circuit of the 1960s taught him that being the best in a specific moment does not confer permanent dominance. It confers the opportunity to prepare for the next moment, and the preparation is always more reliable than the protection of what the current moment has produced. The films slow down. The box office numbers moderate. Hollywood, which operates on the merciless logic of the most recent result, begins offering the kinds of projects that reflect a recalibration of expectations. Chuck accepts some and declines others, with the selectivity of a man who understands that not every opportunity is worth the cost of taking it. He is not finished. He knows he is not finished. The second act he is building is not in Hollywood. It is in Texas. And the audience it will find is not the young men who made Missing in Action #1. It is the people who watched those young men grow up, who stayed home on Saturday nights and wanted something on their television that reflected their values, their faith, their understanding of justice and family, and the specific kind of American life that the action films of the 1980s had gestured toward without quite arriving at. Walker, Texas Ranger, is coming. But before Walker, there is one more thing that the 1980s have to show Chuck Norris about who he is when the films are not telling him. His marriage to Diane ends in 1989, after 31 years. The ending is not dramatic. It carries the particular sadness of a long marriage that has run its course, that has survived everything the world threw at it, and has finally encountered the thing it cannot survive. The distance between two people who have grown in different directions over 30 years and who find, in the quiet of the decade's ending, that they have become people who are better apart than together. Chuck bears this privately, as he bears everything private, without public processing, without the management of the narrative that celebrity culture requires from its participants. The marriage ends, he continues. The discipline that has carried him through every difficult thing is still there, still doing what it has always done, keeping him moving when the path is not clear, pointing toward the next thing that needs to be done. The next thing is Texas. Episode 5, Walker, Texas Ranger, the reinvention that nobody expected, the audience that nobody predicted, and the 8 years that made Chuck Norris more famous than any film he ever made. This is Legends of America.